Oh my god! Oh my god, Jazz told me so many bad things about the stage.
Jazz took my job basically.
No!
They were at the day when I was saying that it was a gun.
Oh my, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, the
okay,
other
that's-
day,
that's
I
right.
would have thought that was an everyday occurrence, to be honest.
But it was no real gun, like it was like a BB gun or something, but it was like still.
Were they trying to do a legal?
Yeah, no,
They threw a chair at the ceiling and broke all the tiles because
You know, St. Allen's Shop,
yeah.
and at the end of St. Allen's Shop, there's a Games Cafe.
Yeah,
Yeah, that used to be a William Hill, and that place used to get done on a weekly basis, like I blind in there with guns. Basically, like every week, they shut it, they shut that William Hill for more than 10 years, basically. But not just the gun, people would go in there, celebrate Model 2, go in there and smash the fuck out of it. Just walk in with baseball bats and just smash it up, take all the money. And like, if you're working in it, like minimum wage, you're not going to stop the taking
So, because I used to work on this bar in St. Helens Road as well. I didn't quit there.
That shop gets robbed every fucking week.
Oh my god. That's what I was been doing this summer.
That shop is just like the Wild West.
It was robbed every day. And it would be like,
So honest to God, the amount of shoplifting that's going in is staggering.
no, and it's still like dog food.
Yeah, I've been there like buying bags or something, and you can just see people robbing stuff.
It's common. We had to have, it was got so bad, we had to have a TV with cameras out in front of our face when we were serving customers, so we could have cameras on. So we could look at the same time as looking at customers.
What about security? Like any type of like...
No, anyone does.
We had like, it's a section at the back where we give people to drink, like in a different section. So you have to keep the shutter down because the master said if you want anything, you're going to have to come to the counter and tell us. Because you couldn't even keep it open. Because someone stole like £200 worth of wine, put it in their bag wrestling on the way out. But it's like,
That's every day.
but it's like, yeah, but then like you said, when you're on my side, do you want to jump over as well? I'm not doing that. I used to know it was this and I used to just get them out.
Give it more. Yeah, a packet of facts. Okay, so let's plough through this so I can go through the assignment. Wait, mouth.
Sorry.
Now, in contemporary gaming, game design has, over the past 15 years, become incredibly lazy. The reason being, I think, is the success of games like, in particular, GTA 3 and its follow-ups, San Andreas and Vice City. That gave a model for how you could design games and narrative in games, which was all about telling the story through cutscenes. So you move continually between cut and action, cut and action, cut and action. As I said, the model for this came from, I think the game which is most responsible for this is Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid from 1998, where that game was very successful and did something incredibly new and was very exciting at the time because nobody had ever seen anything like this previously. It did give a model for, like, we don't have to invest gameplay and narrative at the same time. You can park narrative and have this switch between two modes. So there are two ways of looking, I think, at cutscenes. You can either say that they drive narrative and do not interrupt the gameplay itself, so the gameplay can remain something separate, or they can be intensely annoying. I think that depends very largely on two issues. One, who's playing it? So what does that player want from the game itself? Personally, I've seen enough cutscenes over the years. I don't really engage with them much anymore. I'd much rather be playing. But that's me. That's what I bring to a game itself. Other people bring different things and might well want to sit through the cutscenes, for example. You know, that is what they're interested in. I can see, you know, different people play games for different reasons, so that's absolutely fine. The second element, which is very important here though, is how those cutscenes are done. Are they something which genuinely builds the game, or are they something which actually annoys, takes away from the game, takes too much time away, and doesn't add to the experience? And one of the problems, I think, with contemporary game design is we see far, far too much of that second type, where cutscenes are there for cutscene's sake. You know, it's like, we're going to develop this game, we better put a shit ton of cutscenes in. It's like, okay, I'm on board, but what are these cutscenes going to be about? And they're not interesting, they aren't well done, they aren't well acted, they aren't well animated, they take you out of the experience of the game rather than immersing you further in the game. I guess the whole thing with cutscenes is they're a skill, just like the game design itself. They need proper writing, they need proper execution, they need to be linked to the game in a very important way in order for them to be effective. It's only my reflection, but I think there's far too many games which don't do that well. You know, and the cutscene acts as a way of breaking the game rather than improving the game. Why are they used? Well, you can combine dialogue and action in a way that keeps the player in action even though we're not. Does anyone know? Okay, so I've mentioned the game. I'm sure most of you haven't played the game, but there was a really, really good reason why Hideo Kojima and Konami had really long cutscenes in the game Metal Gear Solid. But does anyone know why?
They did a lot of effort in the story or no? Actually,
That's a secondary issue.
They cut down on development time, so you don't have to build as many missions or fill out as many hours in game time.
That's a good point. It doesn't bear true for this one though, because it was originally a 2-disc game. So they sort of kept the development time and the amount of missions. So it was a much longer game because of that. There's something much more mechanical here, which actually doesn't really exist anymore. But up until PlayStation 4 did really exist, PlayStation 4 and the Xbox series that came out then, it was a big problem for games. Cutscenes hide loading times. There's a really simple reason why they were used in especially with massive multiplayer, massive open world games. You have a hell of a lot of loading that needs to be done off discs. So if you could put cutscenes in there which could sit on discs separately from the game loading, they would hide the loading time of the game.
smart.
It is smart. The problem with that is you can't skip them, because they have an actual function in how the game works, so you can't skip over them, or the point at which you can skip them is actually the point that the data is loaded for the next part of the game.
I never knew that.
Ah, there you go, see. So they were a really... Because prior to having lots of cutscenes in games, you literally just had a screen that said loading. If you ever get the chance, I actually wouldn't recommend this anyway, but I might bring this console in to put in the room. I've got a PlayStation Classic, and it's got Resident Evil 1 on it, the original Resident Evil game. It's really difficult to play these days. The controls are just terrible on it, and the camera angles are just weird. Great game, really fascinating game to play now even. It's still got some creepy elements to it. You would hate playing it, because you do something for like 10 minutes, work your way through to a room or something like that, then you have to save the game, and then it sits for about 4 minutes, loading the next bit. And you will have literally just got a screen that says loading with a bar underneath it. And so you think back now, I said, why did we tolerate this? What the fuck did I used to do? I think I must have got up, and I would have been about 16, 17 at that point. I must have gone out the front and had a cigarette or something, while waiting for the next bit of the game to start, like, you know. And then I was a teenage chain smoker, you know, which wasn't great for my health, basically. But you look at it now and you think, I'm sitting there, come on, I've got things to do here, like, you know, either keep me engaged and involved or don't. So the cutscene came in as a way of keeping people engaged, because particularly when games got more complex in the 1990s, you tended to have a lot of loading that needed to be done off discs, and people got really annoyed, and it became a big thing. It's like, loading time is too long. But even up to PlayStation 3, that was a big problem. It was only when you got the extra processing power of the PlayStation 4 generation of consoles. Now, PlayStation 5, I don't think I've ever seen a loading thing on PlayStation 5. I don't ever remember seeing one. I've had one for like 3 years. I can't ever remember being subjected to loading. So they had a very specific purpose at first. Prior to having animated cutscenes, we used to have a lot of text scenes. In essence, video games were like movies from the 1920s. You think of an old movie where you have a little bit of stuff happen and then there's like a cut and there's like writing on a screen and then it goes to the next bit because there was no sound in films, so you had to tell people what was going on via text. Up till the mid-90s, that was the traditional way of doing it. So cutscenes in the past were text-based rather than actual sound-based. Again, they served kind of the same purpose, getting rid of loading times. So cutscenes, when we think, if you want to reflect on cutscenes in your video, think very closely about what they do and how you feel about them. Yeah.
So yesterday I listened to an interview with a neuroscientist that actually said that they measured that when they do breaks after some time, that it actually makes the experience more enjoyable. Because I don't know if it is done now in the game specifically, or they haven't thought about it yet.
There's a lot of evidence to suggest that breaking up video games in that way does increase enjoyment, because it's a fairly simple neurological technique here. You have a long period of excitation, but you can't keep that peak going for a long period of time because you get exhaustion. Yeah. Well, not even flow so much, arousal would be the key element of this. One of the problems with arousal is that we can't sustain it. So after a certain period of time, arousal will drop off naturally because the body says, right, we've had enough of this now, we need to calm down. So game design traditionally has been about this. Even if you think about something like Pong, for example, Pong has 15 points. You know, the first player to 15 wins the game. That means, realistically, when they first designed the game, it shouldn't have lasted longer than about 10 minutes. So that would be a nice period, a 10-minute period of arousal, and then you drop off and you start the next game. That would be a lovely way of doing things. It's basically how they design things in Las Vegas, effectively. If you look at slot machines, if you look at traditional way that card games are structured, they go for about 10 minutes. One of the problems with Pong was that if you got really good at it, you could make 1 point go on for about 5 hours. If you got super good at the game, and especially if it was two-player and you were playing someone else who was also good, games could go on for days. Literally, people, I think that, you know, there's a ridiculous record for the longest game in Pong, but it's well over 24 hours. And, you know, so don't you need to sleep? So, we can stretch that out further. Traditionally, design of cutscenes needed to be there to cover up loading times. But the way that loading times worked on disk-based games was you pretty much had that inbuilt, that idea of an excitation period and then a stop, excitation period and stop. But if you look, for example, at a mission, say in GTA or Red Dead Redemption, they're very specifically timed, the missions, because they don't go too long, because they know players will get bored if the mission goes on for a very long time. So you've got that period of, like, you know, excitation and arousal, but it's got to end very quickly. You don't have a battle that could, but there's no reason why things can't go on. If you look at something like Call of Duty, for example, you could have a particular thing go on for hours, you know, and people seem quite happy with that. So it varies, I think, but there is evidence to suggest, you know, it's been well known for a very long period of time. You know, you might think, you know, television program, why is there a break, you know, after 12 minutes of a television program? Well, by and large, 12 minutes is about enough. Now, the optimum way of lecturing is in 17-minute blocks. You do 17 minutes, stop, 17 minutes, stop, 17 minutes, stop. That apparently is the best way for you to learn. Fuck that, I can't be bothered to plan it. It sounds like a lot of effort to me, you know, but whoever thought that 2 hours in a row was a good idea, I don't know. Because it's not good for me and it's not good for you. When I was in the 3rd year of university, it was 3 hours in a row. No break.
It still is.
No fucking break in that 3 hours. I had to listen to some fucking old guy going on about Immanuel Kant for 3 hours straight. I have no sympathy for any of you. We have, in video games, different types of characters. Okay? Now, we usually think of character in terms of the character that we are, but the narrative function of games relies on far more than just that singular character. So you have stage characters, which are just part of the scenario, if you like, your classic NPCs that aren't really doing anything. Functional characters that have a function in the game. Cast characters, ones that you actually interact with in particular ways. Play characters, who we are, and then iconic characters, which are empty of personality but serve a function. The reason why I list iconic characters separately here is that is the category that women in games usually take, where they have no personality whatsoever but serve a function in it. So if you're going to Princess Peach or something like that, it'll be an iconic character. Talking to NPCs in the game world can uncover plot lines and context for characters and events, as well as giving quests in games. When you think about how the world is populated in the game, think about the other characters that you encounter and what other characters there are in games. Because that's incredibly important to the character of the story and how the story unfolds itself as well. And again, that shows a development over time, because in the history of video games, other characters were usually antagonists. If I think of a classic game here, Capcom's classic game Final Fight from the 1980s. It's a classic what we call side-scrolling beat-em-up. You're a character, you have to progress from left to right across the screen as the screen progresses, beating the shit out of everything that comes up against you. Now, those characters that you encounter have different characteristics, but they are not really fleshed out characters. They are just people who are trying to beat you up, that's all. On the basis of the cutscene, which explains why you are there and what you are doing, which inevitably is down to, like, you have to rescue your either daughter or wife or girlfriend. That's it. Okay. Characters in games have moved on a bit since those days, fortunately, but the purpose of different characters is very often to drive narrative in a way that doesn't mean you have to take away from the ludic aspects of how it's played. As Zach was saying earlier, we picked out an example of a video game where we have something called branching. So there are 3 ways that we can tell a story in a video game. One of the things that is really important in games, but in any kind of storytelling, is that you will want to avoid what you call plot bottlenecks. A plot bottleneck is where you have a convergence of stories. You get to a point in a story and you can't go any further. So doing that is story death, basically. And you will get scenarios like this where games go over the cliff, because like the storyline, all of a sudden it makes sense for a while and it's like, oh my god, that was so unrealistic, that wouldn't happen. It does point to the fact that narrative has to be quite involved in that sort of beginning, middle and end. Narrative in games has 2 parts, the structure and the portrayal. So the structure refers to the progression of the story, the different sections and subsections, and how they are interconnected. The portrayal is how the game conveys that. And these always have to work together as well. So in a game narrative, you have to have structure and portrayal linked with one another, or otherwise they're going to be jarring and disconcerting, and you're not going to care too much about what happens. And typically we have 3 kinds of ways that game stories are told. Linear, we call a string of pearls, and a branching system. Linear would be your Assassin's Creed, where the main story unfolds in a linear fashion from beginning to end. It's overwhelmingly the most popular way of telling stories in games. A string of pearls, technically, well, I can't come to it in the next slide. Linear is all, it's a fairly familiar concepts. The structure found in mediums such as literature and films. A linear structure is basically every film you've ever seen. Now, somebody should turn around and say this at this point and say, but Leighton, I've seen Pulp Fiction. Does anyone want to have this thing here where they want to tell me that they've seen Pulp Fiction?
I've seen Pulp Fiction.
You've seen Pulp Fiction, Adam,
Yeah.
yeah? Has that got a linear storytelling structure?
Not really.
Not really, no, because we think it's not linear because Quentin Tarantino took a razor to the film and rearranged it in terms of its temporal structure. It has a linear storytelling technique because if you just move those bits around, it would be a linear story. All he's done is just shifted the bits around. There's nothing sophisticated about this, but it's apparently postmodern. That's not what postmodernism means. But, it's an interesting little technique and it keeps you guessing. With a classic example of when people say, you know, films don't have linear techniques. Have you not seen Christopher Nolan's Memento? I was like, yes, I have seen Christopher Nolan's Memento. The black and white bits are told in reverse. So if you remove those bits from the films, you have the linear story going forward. And then if you watch the black and white bits in the other order, it's also a linear story. There's nothing non-linear about this, it's been portrayed in a different way. And overwhelmingly, the vast number of films, you know, so Jay might turn around and say, oh yeah, what about Gravity's Rainbow, Leighton? Is it Gravity's Rainbow? Oh, okay, well you will at some point. And then I would say, but Jay, Gravity's Rainbow is a linear narrative. It's just that Thomas Pynchon has decided to tell the narrative in a slightly different way. So, but what about Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5? I was like, shut up, that is... Yeah, no, we'll get into the whole thing. So, in a linear narrative, the story progresses from one event to another, right? Fairly straightforward. If you look at the diagram at the top, we're not talking about anything, which is rocket science here. Now, if we have a purely linear narrative in a video game, it means players have no interaction with the story. You are simply asked to progress the story forward. The story has already been written. Many games will combine linear narratives with a sort of string of pearls or branching technique. So if you have a vast open world game, what you will have is the main story and then those secondary missions which exist outside of the main storyline. You can choose just to complete the main story, or you can choose to do a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So it offers you the choice of doing that. But traditionally, in fact, linear games have been the most popular way of actually telling the story in the game. Linear game, we don't influence the story. The story has already been written for us. We simply play through that storyline. That means the game can only be completed in one way. And traditionally that's been the way. Until the last 15, 20 years, that has been the primary way of playing video games. The string of pearls model is where the story is told in a linear fashion but can be interrupted by player freedom. This is what I would call the vast majority of open world games, where you have a linear storyline that needs to be completed, but you may go off and do other things, but they in themselves have kind of linear elements to it as well. You complete one side mission, it unlocks the next side mission, it unlocks the next side mission, it unlocks the next one. So there's only a limited amount of freedom within that. But that's a structure which is completely unique to video games. You can't do that in a film. You can't do that in a piece of literature. You can't do that in a television series. Because they don't have the faculty for us to actually have that level of input and control. You know, if I'm playing GTA 5, I can decide, do you know what? Fuck it. I'm not going to complete the main story. I'm just going to do all the side missions and then I'm just going to drive around mowing down pedestrians. You know, that's what I'm going to do. Alice just laughed at. That's exactly what she's doing as she's playing this game right now for her video, right? That interactivity that's required to tell the story in that way can't be done in other mediums. We don't have the faculty to do it. You typically see this in any kind of role-playing game. Most role-playing games will have this faculty in them. And you're given freedom of exploration throughout the world, but that freedom is to a certain extent decided for you by how the side missions have been written, how they've been written, the progress, etc. So the string of pearls model is extremely common. What's much less common, but probably would be the best way of doing things, a fully branching story where player choice plays a major role in how the plot and characters in the world develop and how the games end. This type of narrative has been attempted before. before video games in the form of interactive books. This is a novel that gives the reader choices at the end of each chapter, each sending the reader into a different chapter, giving them a chance to create their own story. The problem with that is, one, the stories tended to be awful, and two, it took a long, long time for people to actually move through a storyline, because literally you made a choice, then you had to have another thing sent to you, and then you had to have another thing sent to you. So instead of reading a novel in 2 days, it took you like 2 years, because it actually involved people having to write new parts of it all the time, which wasn't really great. But a fully story-based game will usually take this branching technique. Has anyone got an example of what they think a branching game might be?
Until Dawn.
Say again?
Until Dawn.
Until Dawn. Why?
It's like every character has their own choices throughout, and if you do something, you could kill one of the characters, and it changes the ending.
And not only that, but the presence or absence of other characters, whether they survived previous bits or not, does affect other parts of the story.
Yeah.
Okay, but the story's written.
Yeah.
What about Walking Dead?
So that
That's the same
wouldn't be.
sort of thing, isn't it?
Do you know what? I'd say Walking Dead is a linear narrative.
Really?
Yeah, I'd say it's written. Nick?
With The Sims BX, you literally just create your own storyline.
Yeah. I think The Sims is a fairly good example of this. An open world sandpit where you basically let it go in any direction you want. Other examples are, I would say, Warcraft is the classic example of this. You can basically do a Minecraft to an extent, although it's got corners around there, does a kind of a branching structure. But there's not many. The big online games tend to have this structure. What were you going to say, Nick?
I was going to ask you, like Mass Effect or Until Dawn, where decisions can change aspects of the story, though the main beats of the story stay the same, the context of them change depending on what characters are alive.
Now,
How
I
would
think
you
that's a
classify
partially narrative. I think that's a partially linear story.
Partially linear.
Partially linear. I think that probably fits with the string of pearls model more than anything. It's a really clever technique though, because what's interesting about it, about the Mass Effect series, and it's been, again, they were the pioneers of this, it got copied from them, is that notion of agency over the story. That if I choose to do this here, Cyberpunk does this if anyone cared about that game, they would see they do it in a really interesting way. It's very hard to care about that game, I think, but it's robbed it basically, I think, of Mass Effect, right? Because it gives you the sense of agency over the linear narrative, so it doesn't appear linear to you. But at the end of the day, if it's got that kind of branching from a string of pearls sort of thing going on, but the strings of pearls loop back into the main narrative all the time.
Yeah.
So you feel like you've been given like 3-4 different ways. But I don't think it's a branching thing where the ending has not been decided. In fact, in a branching story, there is no end.
Yeah.
So I'd say it's something like No Man's Sky, for example, adopts the branching technique. But there's not many out there, and it's incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah. And you could only argue really the branching elements happen at the end of individual stories at the end of the game.
I agree, 100%. Which again adds layers of complexity, which means this would be cool if it could be done. But I think there's very limited ways in which this could even be done. I was going to say, well, yeah, fuck it, we've got time. Some of you may not have played these games, but some of you will have. Life is Strange. Any Life is Strange players here? What do we think, Zach?
Linear.
It is purely linear. In fact, I would say the Life is Strange series isn't just linear, it's a rail game where you never get off the rail. Back in the day, rail shooters were seen as the worst kind of games because you had no agency whatsoever. You just shot what came in front of you all the time. Life is Strange has been praised for its narrative depth. If you do a narrative analysis of Life is Strange, it's like it doesn't have any narrative depth whatsoever. It is simply all out in front of you. That doesn't mean it's not a good game to play. I quite like those games actually. I think that I thought the first one was absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed it, but when you sit back with me, it's like I have no agency in that at all. It's a bit like when I say Indiana Jones, you all know who I mean, right? has anyone seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first film? What agency does Indiana Jones have in that film?
Put that belongs in a museum, you know.
Yeah.
Stop the Nazis from getting the lost.
Does he?
No, they get it and they die.
Yeah. Indiana Jones is completely incidental to that film.
Yeah. If
He has no role in how that film ends
if he-
whatsoever.
yeah, if he
There's
was-
no point to him at all.
if he was
The
in
film would have ended exactly the same if he wasn't in it. They would have taken the Ark to that creepy island, and then they all would have died. There was no point to him whatsoever. It's like that, weirdly, Raiders of the Lost Ark is a really bad story because the main character has no role in the main narrative whatsoever. It would have ended that way if that character didn't exist.
But did you enjoy it? Because I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was alright.
Yeah.
Especially when that Nazi guy goes into the plane propeller. That's really funny. But and when he shoots that other guy with a sword, yeah, that's pretty cool. But like none of that is incidental to what happened in the film. Just, it would have ended. They may as well just said those guys found that thing, took it there, and they all died. Yeah, that would have happened anyway. He has no purpose whatsoever to the telling of the story. I kind of feel that way when I played Life is Strange for a little bit. I had no purpose at all to how the events unfolded in the game. So it very linear, I would say. GTA 5. What do we have here?
String of Pearls.
String of Pearls, yeah. Classic String of Pearls. GTA Online. I don't know if we've got any players here, but
You can do it.
kind of a branching thing. It's now it's got elements of String of Pearls and it's got elements of linear, but in a real sense, there's a branching element too. What we see, particularly with adaptations of open world games into online environments, is that they maintain the String of Pearls thing, but also try to overlay a branching technique on top. With greater or lesser success. Some people like roaming those spaces, depending on how attached they are to those spaces. I was saying earlier, particularly, they've jettisoned the Red Dead Redemption online world now, which I think was a big mistake, because loads of people just liked riding their horse around. You know, and I kind of get that. You know, it's kind of a cool space to hang out in. The only thing that was annoying is some kid would come and try and rob you, and then you'd have to kill them. But annoying, not so much annoying as kind of fun as well. You know, killing kids is always fun. Skyrim,
Linear. Even though
very much a linear, I think, but often gets confused for something which is much more complex, like a branching. And I really don't think it is. There is a lot of trickery that goes on, I think, and the game developers will try and tell us that things are much more complex than they actually are, which is really, really problematic because we're getting ripped off. Henry Jenkins has to stick his fucking oar into everything, right? So Henry Jenkins, RPGs are modes of collaboration in storytelling. Many games construct immersive worlds through spatial and environmental storytelling that relies on pre-existing associations within popular media cultures. Now, the reason why I draw on Jenkins here, I'm usually very anti-Henry Jenkins, but I think he says something very, very important at this point. He's absolutely right about environmental storytelling, but he's also right to draw this, that relies on pre-existing associations within popular media cultures. So the way that we get into a storytelling environment in video games is not blind. We have experience with other texts, with other forms of media that inform us about what this is going to be about, and we find those stories understandable because of our experience of other media. So if we didn't read, for example, if we didn't watch television, if we didn't watch films, the narrative elements of video games would be much less sensible to us. We rely on what we know from other media to create the stories ourselves to a certain extent. So, because of that, games enable us to enact these emergent narratives because we understand. We know, for example, how the Western genre kind of goes out. We know how the crime genre works as something, you know? We know how sci-fi films basically operate. So we already have a model of how the narrative's going to work. And because of this, game makers can rely on that. Game makers can assume pre-existing knowledge on the part of their players. So they can skip parts, they can, Mass Effect doesn't give you the history of space travel. It instead assumes that you've watched a whole bunch of sci-fi films, including Star Wars, etc., so you know what this is going to be about, right? Now, games do, though, according to Jenkins, tell stories in very unique ways. What he says we have here is a form of 4 different narratives which games can do. We have evoked narratives, where it's a world known by other media. Now, I've just done some screenshots here from one of my favourite games, which is called Snatcher by Hideo Kojima. Snatcher as a storyline is actually, it relies on you as a person to bring a lot to it, and in particular, it's a real benefit if you've seen the 2 films, Blade Runner and The Terminator, because basically it's a combination of those 2 things. If you've seen those films, you'll know exactly what's going on. We have inactive narratives where the story comes through activities, where we've kind of discussed this already. Embedded narratives where the game space becomes a memory palace for the narrative. I think enacted and embedded we see in the vast number of games in contemporary culture. And emergent narratives where the game space is rich with narrative potential. This is your open world game basically, where you explore the environment and stories emerge from that exploration and stuff. What Jenkins says is that game designers don't just tell unique stories in each way, but draw on all of these. To a certain extent, we are always drawing on all these types of narratives in order to build a game narrative. So we always know something about the world through other media. Yeah.
For like the game that I want to do for my first assignment is, so like the game that is above it, let's say then, it's like a AAA game, whatever, and then it's a game within that game, do you know what I mean? And then it's been adapted into its own spin-off because it's inside that. Is that an evoked narrative?
It's definitely an evoked narrative. And wider than that, Jay, it's not just evoked from that previously existing game. It's evoked from other games that have the same kind of format, other games which have that same kind of fantasy context. So evoked would go wider than just the predecessor game. It would go to a wider cultural frame that it fits in. In addition, how do we tell series? How do we tell stories? An incredibly important part is repertoire. Now, this is from Wolfgang Iser's work, and I think I've put Iser's book in the reading folder if anyone wants to have a look at it. He looks at Resident Evil series. What he argues is the Resident Evil series relies on knowledge of the horror genre, horror films, action films, and most importantly, how to cheat at video games. You need all of these things in order to understand how to progress through. Because actually what's interesting in Resident Evil is if you try and play it straight, you won't get through it. You have to think about, well, how can I get around doing this thing all the time? Because you always come up against a block point where it's like, shit, I can't get past this. So you have to think, well, how do I cheat my way around it? The cheats are actually built into the game structure itself. This repertoire is activated by cues in the game and cues outside the game. For example, the paratext around it, the game cover, the cutaways, etc., etc. So we know, for example, it's going to be a horror game that's going to have these elements in it because we have the pre-existing knowledge of it. That will tell us what we need to do in the game, and it will tell us how we need to progress in the game also. We fill in the narrative gaps with our knowledge. We call this a heuristic, if you want a very posh word for it. So the word psychologists use when we use pre-existing knowledge to fill in gaps in what's going on. We call that a heuristic. The most common heuristic that we use is a stereotype. You know how stereotypes operate in media, I hope. In the third year of your media degree, I hope somebody has fucking talked about this over the past 3 years. I'm pretty sure I talked about it at some point. And that's a very common heuristic that we use. In games also, the story unfolds as we act, and we actively construct an ongoing story that develops through our interactions with the game world. And the reason why I pull up Road Rash for this, Road Rash is a classic, absolute stone cold classic game from 1991, where you play player A. That's player A, that's me. And you have to drive to the end of a course against a bunch of other bikers who are armed with chains and clubs and can kick you off your bike. Now, the reason why I say autobiography is important here, when I play Road Rash, I have a whole backstory for my guy. And more importantly, I have a backstory for this piece of shit here, Viper. Viper has been, for the past 32 years, one of the banes of my existence. I hate that guy more than any other video game character in history. He is always sneaking up behind me and booting me into a cow or a fucking oncoming car or the cops or something like that. Piece of shit that Viper is. He has not changed over 32 years. He remains a piece of shit. Viper does not exist. I am fully aware that there is no such thing as Viper. I am not a mentalist, but I am fully aware that he is not real. But I have developed a whole backstory for why Viper is like he is, about how his parents mistreated him when he was young, about how they took his toys off him, you know, about how he was made to sit with the dog instead and eat his food out of a bowl. That's made that piece of shit into what he is today. I despise Viper with every fucking inch of my soul. Right? I have constructed an ongoing storyline for this game, which also, interestingly, goes to its sequels, Road Rash 2, Road Rash 3, and Road Rash 3D as well, which I've also played to death over the past 30 years. As the game rolls out, I make new story, basically. Narrative is part of the game, but it cannot alone explain the game. So narrative is important, but you can never take it away from the game itself. If it was the case, then game studies would purely be an extension of English literature, and it isn't. The English literature influence on video game studies is important, really important, I think, but it doesn't explain how we do game studies. Interactivity is key, and narrative, therefore, operates differently. So that's all I want to say about that. That probably took longer than I was expecting, and I know a bunch of you have got to get off to another lecture, so let me do this really, really fast. Because I know last week a lot of you said you hadn't even started or you were in very early stages of doing your project. So let's break this down into how am I going to give you a 70+ grade for this? Because that's what you all want, isn't it? Basically, at the end of the day, that's what we all want. Do you know what? That's what I want to give you as well. Because the more 70+s that I can award, the better I look as well. Let's help one another out here. Okay. 12 to 15 minute video. This is what I advise people do. I would first of all construct the visual aspect of the video. But in order to do that, you need to pick 3 or 4 themes that you're going to talk about. Go back through the lectures and pick out, here are 4 things I want to talk about in my game. Here are 4 things that we've covered in the course. Okay? So give yourself headings first of all. Then go to the game and create some footage around those. 3 to 4 minutes of footage for each. If you think about, if you're doing 4 themes, you might want to do 3-4 minutes each. That's going to fit your 15-minute video. And then you've got to think, right, I've got to speak for like 3 to 4 minutes on this. Write those 3 to 4 minute scripts. Record yourself record literally, have a look how long your footage is, and try and time yourself talking about it in that time. And then just literally drop the audio clips over the video clips and stitch it all together in a video editor. Give that to me when what you're talking about, remember, to an extent, although I want the video to look decent, obviously, but it will look decent. Your stuff is coming from capture, so it's going to look pretty good anyway. What do I want to hear from you is a clear explanation of, firstly, remember what the purpose of this is, how what you're talking about explains your experience of playing the game. That's the core. As long as you're talking about those things, you're doing fine. This is not a biography of the game. This is not a discussion of the theory that you are talking about in abstract. This is about how that theory explains how you play. Okay? I want to see that discussion informed by the theory that I've discussed in the module, the theory that you've gone away and read, the theory that you've picked up from the reading folder, from all the papers that are up on the canvas, what you've done in your own research. So instead of thinking it perhaps as a 15-minute video, you can think about it as 3 videos or 4 videos that are stitched together. If that helps you in terms of breaking this down easier, think of it in those terms. So I've got to do 4 very short, separate videos, which I'm then going to stitch together and edit into one piece. You do that, you talk, I'm actually going to go there with this one. You use 10 different sources academically. I can't not give you 70, really. Do you know what I mean? How can I not? So that's what you need to do.
Do I need a capture card for my PlayStation? Because obviously you can record it. You can record it on the actual PlayStation.
Yeah.
But it's just how am I getting it off?
Exporter.
You can on the PlayStation.
Yeah, you can export that file, right?
I'll have a look. I haven't checked. That's why I didn't know if I needed a capture
Me
card. or not.
either, because I was thinking of doing the same thing.
Interesting.
I know with images and screenshots you can plug in a USB and pop them
Yeah.
directly onto the USB.
That's how I do
It'll
it.
be the
So,
same.
yeah, I'll do that.
If you've got a USB or an external hard drive, you can plug that into. If you've got a PlayStation 4,
Fine.
oh, well, 5 would work the
4
same
Pro.
way actually, because the port is right in the front as well. Just plug that in, and you can set it up so it, your recordings go onto the hard drive.
Right. Okay. That's
Yeah.
fine.
PlayStation 4 is even simpler. I think it will automatically do that. Probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
You just choose exports to go to your HD.
There'll be a YouTube guide online about how to do it.
Yeah.
I was worried I was going to have to like screen record it on my phone on the PlayStation app.
No, I don't think
So
you do
much,
it.
like,
Again,
frame
as
rate.
Kyriaka says, YouTube it. You will be told how to do it in 2 seconds flat, you know. And they actually export in a fairly small file size as well. It's not like sometimes where you have like things, you have like 2 minutes of footage with like 4 gig or something ridiculous like that. This is manageable, I know. Yeah, there isn't a huge amount of time, I know, but if you break it into smaller tasks, I think, you know, you're going to be fine with this. It's not asking too much then. This is a deceptively big assignment. It's actually not that big. But remember as well, keep your bibliography. Submit the bibliography with your cover sheet as well. Hopefully, sometime this week, I'm going to be able to tell you exactly when the submission date is for this, but I'm prepared to do this. If they do move the submission date early,
Really, there's a
and relax. If they move it, because last year was on a Thursday, they do tend to keep it year on year the same day. So if it's going to be submitted on Thursday the 30th, what you will need to do, Alice, is submit your cover sheet and bibliography before 2 p.m. on the 30th.
okay.
And then you submit the video to me, because the video comes directly to me once you've uploaded it to YouTube. Just submit the link to me, just email me the link, just as you did with your social media project, right? Very important for those YouTube submissions, have your videos set to unlisted, not private. I cannot mark them if they're private, because I can't mark something I can't see. If you want them public, if you've got a public-facing YouTube channel, knock yourself out. That's absolutely fine. I haven't got any problem with that at all. But if you don't have that, I would set it to unlisted so I can view it and then nobody else can. Perfect.
Just